"You're a parasite we can't afford to feed anymore. Get your bags and get out before I call the sheriff," my father roared, his voice echoing off the cold linoleum of the kitchen in our house on Walnut Street in Philadelphia. It was exactly 11:22 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the digital clock on the microwave hummed with a low, oppressive buzz that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The temperature outside had plummeted to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relentless, freezing sleet was already turning the long, cracked driveway into a treacherous sheet of black ice that glinted under the flickering street lamp. My name is Cassidy Blackwood. I am 32 years old, and today I serve as a Senior Forensic Auditor for the Internal Revenue Service, a position that requires a surgical precision for detail and a complete immunity to intimidation. 12 years ago, my father, Arthur Blackwood, threw my entire existence into two 30-gallon heavy-duty Husky trash bags and watched as I dragged them through the slush, my sneakers soaking through within seconds. Today, I have returned to that same colonial-style house with its peeling white paint and the overgrown hedges I used to trim for no pay. But I am no longer carrying my belongings in plastic bags. I am carrying a federal seizure warrant and a leather briefcase containing the documented evidence of a decade of systematic tax evasion and money laundering. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to understand the weight of the badge currently clipped to my charcoal gray Brooks Brothers blazer, I must take you back to that Tuesday night in 2012 when the world I knew collapsed under the weight of my father's greed. At 20 years old, I was a student at Temple University, balancing 20 credits and a part-time job at a local diner, trying to save every penny for a future that didn't involve the constant fear of my father's temper. My father owned Blackwood Construction, a mid-sized firm that specialized in residential renovations throughout the Delaware Valley. And to the neighbors, he was the quintessential self-made man who drove a gleaming 2011 Ford F-150 Lariat and never missed a Sunday service at the local parish. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of reality, one governed by ledgers I wasn't allowed to see and late-night phone calls that ended in shouted threats. My brother, Marcus, who was 23 at the time, was the golden child, the one my father groomed to take over the business despite the fact that Marcus couldn't calculate a profit margin if his life depended on it. Marcus spent his days driving a brand-new Jeep Grand Cherokee that my father had bought him in cash, while I was forced to beg for gas money to get to my morning lectures. The conflict that night hadn't started over something monumental. It began because I had found a discrepancy in the household utility bills while trying to help my mother, Elena, organize the kitchen drawers. I had noticed that the electric bill for our modest four-bedroom home was nearly $800 for the month of October, a figure that made no sense unless we were running a small factory in the basement. When I questioned the amount, my father's face turned a deep, bruised shade of purple, the kind of color that precedes a cardiac event or a violent outburst. He didn't explain the bill. He simply snatched the paper from my hand, the sharp edge of the Staples brand invoice slicing a thin line across my thumb that began to bead with bright red blood. He told me that my curiosity would be my undoing, and that as long as I lived under his roof, I would eat the food he provided and keep my mouth shut about the business that kept the roof over our heads. The silence in that house was always a physical weight, a heavy curtain of unspoken truths that smelled of stale cigar smoke and the expensive mahogany polish my mother used on the dining table we rarely sat at together. My mother was a woman of quiet sorrows, a ghost in her own home who spent her afternoons tending to a small herb garden that struggled to survive the Philadelphia winters. She watched that night as I was shoved toward the door, her eyes wide with a paralyzed kind of fear, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle of a ceramic mug filled with Earl Grey tea that had long since gone cold. She didn't say a word when my father grabbed the two trash bags from the pantry and began throwing my textbooks, my worn-out sweaters, and the few pieces of jewelry I owned into the dark plastic depths. The sound of the bags stretching and tearing as he stuffed them full is a noise that has haunted my dreams for over a decade, a rhythmic, crinkling soundtrack to the moment I became an orphan with living parents. As I stood on the porch, the sleet stinging my face like 1,000 tiny needles, I watched the taillights of my father's truck fade into the gray mist of the Philadelphia suburbs. I had exactly $42 in my bank account and a half-empty tank of gas in my 2004 Honda Civic, a car with a rusted muffler that rattled every time I hit a pothole on Broad Street. I spent that first night in the parking lot of a 24-hour Wawa, the neon lights of the convenience store sign flickering in the puddles around me, the smell of cheap gasoline and damp upholstery filling the cramped interior of my car. I realized then that my father hadn't just kicked me out. He had erased me from the family ledger as if I were a bad debt that needed to be written off to balance the books. The years that followed were a masterclass in survival and calculated ambition. I finished my degree while working 3 jobs, living on ramen noodles that cost 30 cents a pack, and sleeping on a mattress I found on a sidewalk in North Philly. I became obsessed with numbers, with the way they could tell a story that people tried to hide, and eventually, I landed a junior role at a local accounting firm. I didn't just work, I hunted. I specialized in forensic accounting, learning how to track the movement of money through shell companies and offshore accounts, how to spot the minute irregularities in a balance sheet that signaled a deeper rot. When I was recruited by the IRS, I didn't see it as a job. I saw it as a destiny. I spent 5 years building my reputation, working my way up the ranks until I was the one they called when they needed to take down the big fish in the tri-state area. All the while, I kept a silent watch on Blackwood Construction. From my desk in the federal building, I watched as my father and Marcus expanded their empire, purchasing a fleet of 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country SUVs for the executive team and moving into a multi-million-dollar estate in Bucks County while maintaining the Walnut Street house as a supposed business office. I saw the way they bypassed local taxes, the way they filed fraudulent 1099 forms for workers who didn't exist, and the way they funneled cash into a series of LLCs registered in Delaware. They thought they were clever, but they were sloppy, fueled by an arrogance that comes from decades of never being told no. They forgot that the daughter they discarded had been the only person in that house who actually understood how the math worked. The morning of the raid, the air was crisp and clear, a sharp contrast to the freezing sleet of my departure 12 years prior. I adjusted the knot of my silk tie in the rearview mirror of my government-issued Ford Explorer, noticing the way my reflection looked nothing like the terrified 20-year-old girl who had been cast out into the cold. My team was already in position, 6 agents in tactical gear, 2 local police cruisers, and a digital forensics expert ready to mirror every server in the building. We pulled into the driveway of the Walnut Street house at precisely 9 a.m., the gravel crunching under the heavy tires of our vehicles. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the white paint now gray and chalky, the front door showing the marks of a decade of neglect. When I knocked, it wasn't my father who answered, but Marcus. He looked older, his hair thinning and his face flushed with the kind of bloated redness that suggested a lifestyle of expensive bourbon and zero accountability. He was wearing a Rolex Submariner that I knew for a fact had been purchased with funds diverted from a municipal contract, and he looked at me with a blank, confused expression that slowly curdled into recognition. He started to say my name, his voice cracking, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a greeting. I simply held up the warrant, the federal seal gleaming in the morning sun, and stepped past him into the foyer that smelled of dust and old secrets. My father was in the kitchen, sitting at the same linoleum table where he had once roared at me. He was staring at a laptop, a pile of crumpled receipts scattered around him like fallen leaves. When he saw me, he didn't move. He didn't even stand up. He looked at my badge, then at my face, and for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of something that resembled fear in his eyes. I pulled out a chair, the same chair I used to sit in while I did my homework, and sat down across from him. I opened my briefcase and took out a thick folder labeled Project Parasite. I watched as he read the name, his hands beginning to shake, the same way my mother's had all those years ago. I leaned forward, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the scent of the stale coffee in his mug, and I spoke in a voice that was calm, professional, and entirely devoid of mercy. The audit was not just about the $4.8 million in undeclared income or the 22 counts of wire fraud we had documented. It was about the fundamental truth that numbers do not lie, even when families do. As my team began to box up his records, loading the same types of heavy-duty bags he had used to discard me, I stood by the window and watched the neighborhood wake up. People walked their dogs and children waited for the school bus, unaware that the pillar of their community was currently being dismantled by the very daughter he had deemed a parasite. I thought about the $42 I had in 2012 and the way the sleet felt on my skin, and I realized that the greatest inheritance my father ever gave me was the coldness I needed to finally finish the job. Family isn't a bond of blood when that blood is used as a weapon. Family is a contract of mutual respect, and when that contract is breached, the interest accrued is a debt that must eventually be paid in full. The Blackwood household was never truly a home, but rather a meticulously constructed stage, set designed to broadcast a lie of middle-class excellence to a neighborhood that was far too busy with its own lives to notice the cracks in our facade. My father, Arthur Blackwood, operated as a mid-level regional manager for a logistics firm, but he possessed the expensive soul of a multimillionaire, a delusional trait that led him to divert nearly 40% of his monthly take-home pay toward membership dues and bar tabs at the Pine Valley Country Club. I watched him every Saturday morning as he meticulously polished his tailor-made golf clubs in the driveway, wearing a crisp Ralph Lauren polo shirt that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, while the real financial foundations of our lives were rotting beneath his feet like unaddressed termites. My sister Bianca was the undisputed Princess of Pennsylvania in his eyes, a 24-year-old college dropout who had managed to fail out of 3 different state schools, yet was rewarded for her incompetence with a leased 2022 Alpine white BMW 3 Series that sat proudly in the driveway as a symbol of our supposed status. While she spent her afternoons getting $60 manicures and posting staged photos of her iced lattes at high-end cafes in Rittenhouse Square, I was the invisible engine room of the family, the one whose existence was tolerated only because I provided a steady stream of supplementary income to fuel their collective delusions. During my final years of university, my life was a grueling, rhythmic cycle of exhaustion that began long before the sun rose over the Philadelphia skyline and ended long after the rest of the city had gone to sleep. I worked 45 hours a week at a 24-hour CVS pharmacy on the corner of 10th and Reed, earning a meager $11.50 an hour, a wage that I stretched with a level of mathematical intensity that would eventually define my career as a forensic auditor. I can still smell the sharp, clinical scent of rubbing alcohol and the dust of 1,000 medicine bottles that clung to my skin after every shift, a smell that followed me onto the SEPTA buses where I would sit with my heavy textbooks cracked open on my lap. I maintained a 3.9 GPA in accounting, not because I was a natural genius, but because I knew that excellence was my only exit strategy, the only ladder tall enough to get me over the walls my father had built around my potential. I paid for every single one of my textbooks, often scouring eBay for used editions that were 2 versions out of date just to save $20, and I skipped meals more times than I care to remember, silencing the hunger in my stomach with lukewarm water from the library fountains. Perhaps the most bitter pill to swallow was the fact that I was forced to pay my own parents a monthly utility fee of $150, a sum my father insisted was necessary to cover the extra water and electricity I used while studying late into the night. It was a cruel irony that I was subsidizing the very roof that felt like it was crushing me, handing over my hard-earned cash in crisp $20 bills every first of the month, while Bianca's expenses were quietly absorbed into the family's mounting debt. I remember sitting in my small, cramped bedroom, the air always 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house because the vent was partially blocked, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the living room where my father was showing off his new leather-bound golf log to my mother. The contrast was a physical ache, a sharp divide between the girl who was being groomed for a life of unearned luxury and the daughter who was treated as a low-interest loan. My father's vanity was a black hole that consumed everything, including his sense of reality, as he would often brag to his colleagues about his daughter's successes, conveniently omitting the fact that one was a professional loafer and the other was a self-funded scholarship student he barely spoke to. He took a twisted kind of pride in my work ethic, but only insofar as it relieved him of any financial responsibility toward me, telling me that the struggle would build character while he simultaneously hand-delivered a credit card to Bianca for a weekend shopping spree at King of Prussia Mall. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the ledgers and the spreadsheets of my coursework, documenting the unfairness of my life with the same detached precision I now use to document corporate fraud. I knew that every hour I spent behind that pharmacy counter, every bus ride in the rain, and every dollar I handed over to my father was a down payment on a future where I would never be beholden to a man who valued his country club status over his daughter's dignity. The atmosphere in the Blackwood house was one of curated silence, where we all played our roles in a script written by a man who was terrified of being seen as ordinary. My mother, Elena, was the silent stage manager of this production, moving through the house with a quiet, frantic energy, trying to balance the checkbook behind my father's back while maintaining the appearance of a woman who didn't have to worry about the cost of a gallon of milk. I would see her late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of past due notices, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the stove clock, her eyes filled with a desperate, haunted exhaustion. She never stood up for me when my father demanded the utility fee, and she never questioned why Bianca was allowed to sleep until noon while I was catching the 5:30 a.m. bus to my first job of the day. She was a victim of the lie as much as she was a participant in it, bound by a misplaced loyalty to a man whose primary concern was the brand of watch on his wrist. My sister Bianca's BMW was more than just a car. It was a rolling insult, a constant reminder that in the Blackwood hierarchy, appearance trumped substance every single time. The monthly lease payment on that vehicle was nearly $600, a figure I knew because I had once found the paperwork shoved into the back of a junk drawer. Yet my father had the audacity to look me in the eye and tell me that he couldn't afford to help me with my $500 tuition gap for the fall semester. I remember the way the leather seats in her car smelled when I was occasionally forced to ask her for a ride when the bus lines were down, a scent of expensive perfume and new car chemicals that felt like a mockery of the damp, metallic smell of the pharmacy where I spent my life. She would talk about her social life and her various failed business ventures with a breathtaking lack of self-awareness, complaining about the stress of choosing a dress for a gala while I was mentally calculating whether I could afford a $3 sandwich for lunch. Every night I would return from my shift at the pharmacy, my feet aching from standing on the hard linoleum floor for 8 hours, only to find the house filled with the sounds of my father's jazz records and the smell of the expensive steaks he insisted on buying even when the mortgage was 2 weeks late. I would retreat to the kitchen to make myself a bowl of generic brand cereal, the only food I felt was truly mine, and listen to him hold court in the dining room, spinning tales of his influence and his grand plans for the future. He spoke of the Blackwood legacy as if he were building an empire, oblivious to the fact that his empire was built on a foundation of credit card debt and the exploited labor of his youngest child. I realized then that my father didn't just want to be successful. He wanted to be worshipped for a success he hadn't actually achieved, and he was willing to sacrifice my youth and my peace of mind to maintain that illusion. This period of my life was defined by a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that I was a stranger in my own home, a visitor who was expected to pay for the privilege of being ignored. I watched as the neighborhood children went off to expensive summer camps and their parents threw elaborate graduation parties, knowing that my own graduation would be marked only by a brief, obligatory dinner where my father would spend the entire time talking about his own college days. The unfairness of it all became a fire in my belly, a quiet, white-hot rage that I channeled into my studies and my work, ensuring that I would never find myself in a position where I had to lie about my worth. I became a master of the shadow economy of the household, knowing exactly which bills were being ignored and which ones were being prioritized to keep the lights on and the BMW in the driveway. When I look back on those years, I don't see a victim. I see a forensic auditor in training, a woman who was learning the hard way that people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect a fraudulent image. My father thought he was teaching me the value of $1, but what he was actually doing was showing me exactly how to dismantle a person like him, how to find the hidden debts and the unrecorded liabilities that exist beneath a polished surface. The $150 I paid him every month wasn't just a utility fee, it was the price of admission to a front-row seat at the slow-motion collapse of a man's ego. I was the parasite, he claimed, but as I sat in that 24-hour pharmacy under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I knew that I was the only thing keeping the Blackwood name from being just another bankruptcy filing in the Philadelphia courts. The weight of that time sits in my chest even now, a reminder of the days when my value was measured in the bills I could provide and the silence I could maintain. I remember one particular Tuesday night, the air thick with the humidity of a Philadelphia summer, when I arrived home after a double shift to find my father and Bianca laughing over a bottle of expensive wine on the patio. They didn't even look up when I walked past, my uniform stained with the ink of a leaking pen and my eyes red with fatigue. In that moment, the disconnection was complete. I was no longer a daughter or a sister, I was a ledger entry, a useful but unremarkable asset that was being depreciated every single day. Little did they know that the asset they were treating with such contempt was the only one that would eventually have the power to audit their lives and find them wanting in every category that mattered. The story of the Blackwoods was a house of cards, held together by my father's arrogance and my mother's fear, and I was the only one who realized that the wind was starting to pick up. I spent my nights dreaming not of wealth or fame, but of a clean balance sheet, a life where the numbers matched the reality and where I didn't have to pay for the oxygen I breathed in my own home. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and while they were busy playing at excellence, I was becoming the person who would one day ensure that the truth was finally, irrevocably documented for the world to see. The betrayal did not come with a scream or a sudden crash, but rather with the cold, calculated desperation of a man who had finally reached the bottom of a hole he had spent years digging with his own arrogance. My father, Arthur Blackwood, had always styled himself as a financial visionary, a man whose instincts for the market were superior to the slow, steady accumulation of wealth that my forensic training taught me was the only true path to stability. While I was meticulously documenting every cent of my earnings at the pharmacy, he had been funneling the remnants of the family's equity into high-stakes gambling disguised as offshore cryptocurrency investments, chasing the ghost of a fortune that had long since evaporated. The collapse was inevitable, a mathematical certainty that he had ignored until the very moment the screen on his 2023 Midnight Black MacBook Pro flashed red, signaling that his latest play on an unregulated exchange in the Seychelles had tanked, vaporizing over $80,000 in a single afternoon. He didn't come to me with an apology or a confession. He came to me with a demand, cornering me in the kitchen while I was trying to study for my advanced tax accounting final, his breath smelling of expensive Macallan 12 and the sour metallic tang of panic. He demanded that I hand over my $15,600 tuition savings account, a fund I had built over 3 years of double shifts and skipped meals, claiming it was my duty to save the family home from an impending foreclosure that he had caused through his own reckless vanity. When I refused, looking him directly in his bloodshot eyes and telling him that my future would not be the collateral for his failures, the mask of the doting middle-class father finally disintegrated entirely. He didn't hesitate for a single second, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house I had helped pay to keep standing. At exactly 11:22 p.m., the house became a theater of cruelty, the silence of the Philadelphia night shattered by the sound of him tearing through my bedroom and grabbing the 2 30-gallon Husky heavy-duty trash bags I had used to store my winter clothes. He began shoving my life into those dark plastic voids with a violent, rhythmic efficiency, the sound of my textbooks hitting the bottom of the bags like stones being thrown into a well. My sister Bianca, the golden child who had never known the weight of a workday or the fear of a balance sheet, stood in the doorway of my room, her posture relaxed and mocking. She was wearing the $300 North Face Arctic Down parka in vintage white that I had bought her for Christmas just months prior, a gift I had worked 60 hours of overtime at the pharmacy to afford because I mistakenly thought that generosity could buy a sliver of sisterly affection. She didn't offer a hand or a word of protest. Instead, she pulled out her iPhone 14 Pro Max and began recording the scene, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen as she laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound that cut through the air as she whispered into the microphone about how the parasite was finally being exterminated. The most profound betrayal, however, was silent and domestic, occurring in the hallway just outside my door where my mother, Elena, stood watching the destruction of my dignity with the detached curiosity of a stranger. She didn't look at me, and she didn't look at the bags of my belongings being dragged across the floor. She simply reached out a trembling hand, adjusted the digital Honeywell thermostat on the wall to a more comfortable 68 degrees, and walked away into the shadows of the master bedroom without a single word of defense or a glance back at the daughter she was allowing to be discarded. My father gripped the tops of the bags, the plastic stretching and white-knuckling under the strain, and dragged them down the stairs, the heavy thuds echoing like a funeral march until he reached the front door. He threw them onto the curb of our suburban street, the bags landing in a puddle of freezing sleet that was already beginning to turn the asphalt into a treacherous sheet of black ice. He told me to get out before he called the sheriff to report me for trespassing, his voice a low, dangerous growl that left no room for negotiation or plea. I stood there on the driveway, the temperature dropping to a biting 38 degrees, watching the heavy oak door of my childhood home slam shut and hearing the deadbolt click into place with a finality that felt like a sentence of execution. I didn't cry because my heart had already begun the process of turning into dry ice, a substance so cold it burns anything it touches, freezing my emotions into a brittle, protective shell. I reached into the pocket of my thin, water-resistant windbreaker and found exactly $14 in crumpled ones and a few stray quarters, the entirety of the liquid assets I had left after my father had spent the last 2 years draining my auxiliary accounts through various household fees and forced contributions. I gripped the handles of the trash bags, the plastic cutting into my palms as I began the long, agonizing trek through the dark streets of the Philadelphia suburbs toward the Greyhound station 4.2 miles away. The sleet turned into a steady, freezing rain that soaked through my cheap sneakers within the first mile, the cold seeping into my socks and numbing my toes until I could no longer feel the impact of my feet on the pavement. Every step was a calculation of survival, a silent tally of the miles remaining and the minutes I had left before hypothermia became a genuine threat. I passed the dark windows of houses where families were sleeping, warm and secure behind their brick walls, while I carried the remains of my existence in plastic sacks that grew heavier and more saturated with water with every passing block. The walk was a descent into a specific kind of loneliness that only exists in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, where the only sounds are the distant hum of the interstate and the rhythmic splashing of my own footsteps in the freezing slush. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and as I walked past the closed storefronts and the flickering neon signs of late-night diners, I felt the last vestiges of my childhood naivety burning away, replaced by a cold, forensic clarity. I thought about the $15,600 I had lost, the years of labor I had invested into a family that viewed me as a line item to be deleted when the margins got too tight. I thought about Bianca's laughter and my mother's hand on the thermostat, and I realized that I was no longer a member of that household. I was a creditor who had just been forced into a total write-off. The dry ice in my chest didn't just protect me from the cold, it fueled me, providing a hard, unyielding center that allowed me to keep moving when my muscles began to cramp and my breath started to come in ragged, frozen gasps. I finally reached the Greyhound station on Filbert Street, a bleak, fluorescent-lit terminal that smelled of floor wax and desperation, and sat on a hard plastic bench to wait for the first bus out of the city. The $14 in my pocket felt like a mockery, a pittance that shouldn't have been enough to start a new life, yet I clutched it as if it were $1 million bond. I watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking forward with a mechanical indifference to my suffering, and I made a silent vow to the girl I used to be, the one who thought that hard work and obedience would eventually be rewarded with love. I promised her that I would never again let a man like Arthur Blackwood have power over my balance sheet, and that I would spend every waking hour of my life learning the language of money until I could speak it better than the people who had used it to crush me. I would become the auditor of my own life, accounting for every slight, every betrayal, and every cent that had been stolen from me, and I would wait as long as necessary for the accounts to settle. The bus finally arrived, a hulking metallic beast that hissed as its air brakes released, and as I boarded, dragging my damp trash bags up the stairs, I didn't look back at the city that had birthed me and then spit me out into the sleet. The 4.2-mile journey to that station was the longest audit I have ever performed, a step-by-step examination of the moral bankruptcy of the Blackwood family. I realized that my father's middle-class excellence was nothing more than a Ponzi scheme of the ego, a fragile construction that required the constant sacrifice of the people around him to stay upright. My mother's silence was the audit trail of a woman who had traded her conscience for a heated house and a quiet life, and Bianca's laughter was the interest accrued on a lifetime of unearned privilege. I was the only one in that family who actually understood what things cost, and the cost of staying in that house had finally become higher than the cost of leaving it with nothing. As the bus pulled out of the station and began the long climb onto the highway, the heaters began to blow a thin stream of warm, recycled air over my frozen limbs, and I felt the dry ice in my heart solidify into a permanent fixture. For the next 12 years, that night at 11:22 p.m. became the foundational text of my existence, the 0 point from which I measured all subsequent successes and failures. I moved to a different city, worked 3 jobs, and eventually earned the credentials that allowed me to walk into the Internal Revenue Service as a Senior Forensic Auditor. I learned how to track the scent of a lie through 1,000 pages of financial statements, how to find the hidden offshore accounts, and how to recognize the specific brand of arrogance that leads a man to believe he is above the law. I waited with a patience that was as cold and unrelenting as the sleet that had covered the driveway on Walnut Street, watching from a distance as Blackwood construction grew and then began to show the telltale signs of a company that was cooking its books to keep up with its owner's lifestyle. I saw the new cars, the country club photos, and the lavish parties, and I noted each one as a potential liability in the grand ledger of karmic debt. Today, as I stand in the foyer of that same house, holding the seizure warrant that represents the total collapse of my father's fraudulent empire, I can still feel the weight of those 2 trash bags in my hands. The $14 I had in my pocket that night has been replaced by the authority of the federal government, and the heart made of dry ice has served me well, allowing me to look at my father now and feel nothing but the professional satisfaction of a completed audit. He looks at me and sees a daughter he failed to break, but I look at him and see a delinquent account that is finally being called in for collection. The sleet is gone, replaced by the bright, unforgiving light of a morning raid, and as my team begins to dismantle his life with the same efficiency he once used to dismantle mine, I realize that the most important lesson I ever learned was that you can never truly hide the truth from someone who knows how to count. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I watch my father realize that he is utterly alone in his disgrace, I know that the audit is finally over, and the balance has been restored. I sat on a rigid, cracked plastic chair in the corner of the Filbert Street Greyhound station at precisely 3:15 a.m., the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a sickly yellow vibration that seemed to synchronize with the throbbing headache behind my eyes. The terminal was nearly empty, save for a few sleeping travelers huddled under threadbare blankets and the distant rhythmic sound of a janitor's industrial floor buffer buffing the grime into a dull shine. I was clutching a lukewarm cardboard cup of $1.50 vending machine coffee that tasted of burnt beans and chemical creamer, yet I held on to it for the meager warmth it provided against the damp chill that had settled into my marrow. I reached into my backpack, the zipper snagging on a loose thread of the worn polyester, and pulled out a battered Texas Instruments pocket calculator and a crumpled scrap of a grocery receipt I had found in the bottom of my bag. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline and the cold, but as I smoothed the paper against my thigh, a strange, clinical detachment began to override the shock of my father's betrayal. I had $15,600 sitting in a savings account at the Philadelphia Federal Credit Union, money that was currently being targeted by a man who viewed his own daughter as a financial safety net. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had zero family left in the world. I began to do the math, the buttons of the calculator clicking with a sharp mechanical finality in the silence of the station as I mapped out the next decade of my life with the cold precision of a military operation. I calculated the cost of a bus ticket to a city where no one knew my name, the price of a shared room in a neighborhood where the sirens never stopped, and the exact number of hours I would need to work to finish my degree without taking on a single cent of debt that could be leveraged against me. I realized that if I cut every emotional and financial tie to the Blackwood name, if I committed myself to 80-hour work weeks and channeled every ounce of my repressed rage into specializing in forensic accounting, I wouldn't just survive this abandonment. I would become the person who holds the ledger of truth, the one who possesses the legal and mathematical authority to decide who keeps their house, who maintains their freedom, and who is left with nothing but the consequences of their own greed. I made a blood pact with myself that night under the flickering lights of the terminal, my eyes fixed on the grime-streaked windows as the first hint of a gray dawn began to touch the skyline. I whispered a vow to the empty room that I would not spend my life seeking the hot, messy satisfaction of revenge. Instead, I would seek the cold, permanent reality of restitution, ensuring that every cent stolen from my soul would be returned with interest. The math was simple and unforgiving, much like the life I was choosing to embrace as I waited for the 4:10 a.m. bus to take me toward a future that had no room for sentimentality or forgiveness. I looked at the number 15,600 on the small digital screen and saw it for what it truly was, my ransom money, the price I had paid to buy my own life back from the people who had tried to auction it off to cover their gambling debts. I thought about Arthur's face when I refused to hand over the money, the way his features had twisted into something unrecognizable and monstrous, and I realized that his greatest mistake was teaching me exactly how much everything costs. He had tried to treat me like a depreciating asset, someone whose value decreased with every year of service, but he failed to account for the fact that I was a high-interest investment that was about to mature in a way he couldn't possibly predict. I gripped the receipt paper until my knuckles turned white, the ink of my calculations blurring slightly as a single drop of condensation from the coffee cup fell onto the page, but I didn't let the paper tear. I was building a new foundation on this scrap of trash, a blueprint for a woman who would never again be caught without a contingency plan or a way to track the scent of a lie through 1,000 pages of financial statements. Every minute that ticked by on the station's industrial wall clock felt like a lesson in the architecture of isolation, teaching me how to breathe in a world where I was the only person I could trust to keep the lights on. I imagined my sister Bianca sleeping soundly in her silk sheets, the BMW key fob sitting on her nightstand like a trophy of her unearned privilege, and I felt a surge of ice water through my veins that had nothing to do with the Philadelphia winter. She had recorded my humiliation for her followers, turning my trauma into a digital spectacle, but she hadn't realized that by doing so, she had provided me with the ultimate motivation to ensure her own eventual bankruptcy. I would work until my fingers were stained with ink and my eyes burned from the glow of spreadsheets, and I would learn the intricacies of tax codes and corporate structures until I could see the hidden rot in a business from a mile away. I wouldn't just be an accountant, I would be a hunter of ghosts, a seeker of the paper trails that arrogant men like my father always believe they are clever enough to erase. The $1.50 coffee was the last thing I would ever buy with the mindset of a victim, because from this moment forward, every expenditure would be an investment in the destruction of the illusions that the Blackwoods called a life. As the bus finally pulled into the bay, its heavy diesel engine growling and sending a plume of acrid white smoke into the freezing air, I stood up and felt the stiffness in my legs vanish, replaced by a terrifying, focused energy. I folded the scrap of paper and tucked it into the hidden compartment of my wallet, right next to the $14 in cash that represented the end of my childhood and the beginning of my reign. I climbed the steps of the bus, the driver's face a mask of tired indifference as he punched my ticket, and I found a seat in the very back where I could watch the station fade into the distance. I looked out at the city of Philadelphia, at the dark shapes of the skyscrapers where people were already beginning their early morning shifts, and I felt a sense of liberation that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. My father thought he had discarded a parasite, but he had actually released a predator into the wild, one that he had personally trained to recognize every weakness in his own armor. I closed my eyes as the bus jolted forward, the rhythmic vibration of the tires on the highway acting as a heartbeat for the new Cassidy Blackwood, a woman who knew exactly what she was worth down to the very last decimal point. The journey ahead was not going to be a story of quick success or easy triumphs, but a long, methodical siege against the people who had tried to erase me. I understood that restitution required patience, the kind of patience that allows a forensic auditor to sit in a windowless room for months, cross-referencing thousands of invoices until the one fatal error reveals itself like a beacon in the dark. I was prepared to live in the shadows for as long as it took, to eat generic brand food and wear secondhand clothes while I accumulated the power and the knowledge necessary to call in the debt that was owed to me. Every 80-hour week would be a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the girl who had been kicked out into the sleet, and every promotion I earned would be a step closer to the day I would walk back onto Walnut Street with a badge and a warrant. I wasn't just planning a career, I was planning a reckoning, a systematic dismantling of the Blackwood legacy that would leave nothing behind but the cold, hard truth of their insolvency. My heart, which had felt like dry ice only hours ago, was now a precision instrument, calibrated to detect the slightest tremor of a lie and the exact weight of a hidden asset. I thought about the word restitution and how much more powerful it was than revenge, because revenge is personal and fleeting, whereas restitution is legal, permanent, and undeniable. Revenge is a fire that burns itself out, but restitution is a ledger that must be balanced, a cosmic requirement that the universe demands the scales be leveled. My father had tilted the scales so far in his own favor that he thought he had broken the machine, but I was going to be the one to repair it and use it to crush him under the weight of his own misdeeds. I didn't need him to apologize, and I didn't need my mother to find her voice, and I certainly didn't need Bianca to stop laughing. I only needed them to be held accountable for every cent they had extracted from my life. As the bus crossed the bridge out of the city, the lights of Philadelphia reflecting in the dark waters of the Schuylkill River, I felt the final connection to my old life snap like a frozen branch in the wind. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a student. I was a senior forensic auditor in the making, and I was already beginning the long, silent process of auditing the people who had dared to call me a parasite. The silence of the bus was filled with the ghosts of the night, but I didn't let them haunt me, instead using their presence to reinforce the pact I had made with myself at 3:15 a.m. I looked at the pocket calculator one last time before slipping it back into my bag. The small screen now blank waiting for the next set of numbers I would feed it. I knew that the $15,600 wouldn't last forever, but the resolve I had forged in that station would be an inexhaustible resource, a well of cold, focused intent that would never run dry. I was going to learn how to find money where people thought they had hidden it, how to read the stories hidden in the margins of tax returns, and how to use the law as a scalpel to cut away the fat of corporate greed. When I finally returned to that house, it wouldn't be as a beggar or a victim, but as an officer of the court, a representative of a government that has a very long memory for people who try to cheat the system. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and while my father was busy gambling away our future on offshore crypto, I was busy calculating the exact moment I would take it all back, plus the interest accrued on 12 years of silence and sleet. I spent the next decade of my life meticulously becoming a ghost, a phantom presence that drifted through the high-stakes world of finance while my physical self was undergoing a radical transformation in the city of Chicago. I severed every digital and emotional umbilical cord that connected me to Philadelphia, changing my phone number to an untraceable 312 area code and moving into a sleek, floor-to-ceiling glass high-rise in the Gold Coast where the concierge didn't even know my real last name. I didn't just study accounting in the traditional sense. I treated the Blackwood family's financial history as my primary subject of research, a master's thesis in systematic failure and unearned arrogance. While I was climbing the corporate ladder at a top-tier forensic firm, eventually transitioning into the Internal Revenue Service to gain the regulatory teeth I needed, I was simultaneously building a private intelligence network that allowed me to track my father's every move. Through professional connections and high-level access to credit monitoring tools, I watched from 300 miles away as Arthur Blackwood's middle-class excellence began to fray at the edges, his desperate need to maintain appearances leading him into a spiral of late mortgage payments and increasingly shady short-term loans. I knew exactly when he defaulted on his country club dues, and I knew the exact day he sold the 2011 Ford F-15, just to cover the lease on Bianca's latest automotive whim, a silver 2024 Audi Q5 that he could ill afford. By the time February 2026 arrived, the winter air in Chicago was a brutal, bone-chilling cold that mirrored the state of my own resolve, and Arthur Blackwood had finally hit a mathematical wall he couldn't climb over or lie his way around. His construction business was hemorrhaging cash due to a series of botched renovations and a total lack of oversight, leaving him desperate for a lifeline that no traditional bank in the tri-state area would dream of providing. In a move of utter, predictable desperation, he took out a $450,000 predatory bridge loan with a 12% balloon interest rate from a private equity firm that specialized in high-risk debt consolidation. What he didn't know, and what he could never have guessed in his wildest, most narcissistic dreams, was that I owned that firm through a labyrinthine blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands called CB Assets LLC. I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper overlooking the frozen gray expanse of Lake Michigan, the room smelling of expensive, hand-stitched Italian leather and the rich, nutty aroma of a $400 an ounce espresso from a rare Batch 12 bean. I adjusted my gold Cartier tank watch and picked up a heavy, engraved Mont Blanc fountain pen, feeling the weight of the moment as I prepared to sign the documents that would finalize the acquisition of his soul. The transaction was handled with a cold, clinical efficiency that would have made my 20-year-old self weep with relief, as I authorized the purchase of his total debt for exactly 70 cents on the dollar, effectively becoming my father's primary creditor. I stared at the digital signature pad, the blue light reflecting in the lenses of my Tom Ford glasses, and I realized that I now held the keys to everything he had spent 40 years building on a foundation of lies. The office around me was a sanctuary of success, furnished with a minimalist desk made of reclaimed oak and a single piece of abstract art that cost more than my father's entire house on Walnut Street. Yet I felt no joy, only a profound sense of mathematical completion. I took a slow sip of the espresso, the bitterness of the coffee perfectly complementing the sharp, metallic clarity of my thoughts as I reviewed the terms of the seizure clauses I had personally drafted into the loan agreement. Every time Arthur had roared at me for being a parasite, every time he had demanded my tuition savings to save his failing ego, and every time he had cast me out into the sleet, he had been unknowingly depositing credits into a bank of resentment that was now paying out at an astronomical rate. The process of tracking him had been a study in the slow-motion collapse of a man who believed the rules of physics and finance didn't apply to him, and I had documented every irregularity like a biologist observing a dying organism. I saw how he had tried to hide his crypto losses by inflating the value of his equipment inventory, and I watched as he funneled business expenses into a separate account to pay for Bianca's lavish lifestyle, all of it creating a paper trail that was as bright as a flare in a dark sky. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game of poker with a nameless, faceless corporation, never realizing that the person on the other side of the table was the daughter who had walked 4.2 miles to a bus station with $14 in her pocket. The irony of the situation was a physical sensation, a hum of electricity in the air of my office as the fax machine whirred, confirming that the transfer of his debt to CB Assets LLC was legally binding and irrevocable. I was no longer the girl who was being audited by her family. I was the auditor-in-chief, and the first item on my agenda was the total liquidation of the Blackwood facade. I spent that evening staring out at the Chicago skyline, the lights of the city flickering like the data points on a spreadsheet, and I thought about the concept of a blind trust. It was the perfect metaphor for our relationship, a structure where one party has all the power and the other has no idea who is actually pulling the strings, a dynamic my father had enjoyed for decades until the roles were finally reversed. My name, Cassidy Blackwood, was nowhere on the public filings of CB Assets LLC, buried under layers of shelf companies and legal proxies that made it impossible for him to trace the origin of his new master. I had become a master of the very systems he tried to cheat, using the laws of the land as a cage to trap him in his own negligence, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, he would have no legal recourse and no one to blame but himself. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my lead agent in Philadelphia, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand as I gave the order to prepare the seizure warrant for the Walnut Street property. The time for waiting was over. The interest had been calculated to the 4th decimal point, and the collection phase of my life was officially beginning. The transition from a ghost to an executioner was a seamless one, fueled by the discipline I had cultivated during those 80-hour work weeks and the relentless pursuit of excellence that had become my only companion. I looked at the photograph of the Walnut Street house on my computer screen, seeing the peeling paint and the overgrown hedges, and I felt a flicker of the cold, dry ice in my heart expand until it filled my entire chest. My mother was likely in that kitchen right now, adjusting the thermostat while my father complained about the cost of electricity, unaware that the very air they were breathing was now an asset belonging to a daughter they had erased. Bianca was probably out in her leased Audi, recording another mindless video for her followers, oblivious to the fact that the bank would be repossessing her vehicle before the week was out. I felt a sense of profound, silent power in knowing that I held the life support systems of their reality in my hand, and I was seconds away from pulling the plug with the stroke of a pen. The office was silent, the only sound being the distant hum of the building's HVAC system and the soft ticking of the clock on my wall, which marked the final moments of the Blackwoods' reign of mediocrity. I thought back to the 3:15 a.m. coffee at the Greyhound station. The bitter taste of the vending machine brew a stark contrast to the luxury I now surrounded myself with, and I realized that the $1.50 spent that night was the best investment I had ever made. It had bought me the clarity to see my father for what he was. Not a titan of industry, but a small, frightened man who used volume to hide his lack of substance. I was no longer seeking a place at his table. I was coming to take the table, the chairs, and the house they sat in, converting their emotional debt into a tangible legal reality. I stood up and straightened my blazer, the fabric smooth and expensive against my skin, and walked toward the window to watch the snow begin to fall over the city, a quiet, white blanket that mirrored the silence I was about to impose on my past. The next morning, I would fly back to Philadelphia, not as a guest or a daughter, but as a senior forensic auditor empowered by a federal mandate and a personal mandate that carried even more weight. I would walk up that icy driveway one last time, my heels clicking on the black ice that had once threatened to break me, and I would present the papers that documented the total insolvency of the Blackwood name. The $450,000 loan was the final nail in the coffin, a predatory instrument that I had used to ensure there was no way out for them, no hidden account or secret favor that could save them from the math. I had become the person who decides who keeps their house and who doesn't, and I had already decided that the Blackwoods were no longer eligible for residency in the world of the respectable. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and while they spent a decade pretending I didn't exist, I spent that decade ensuring that their existence would eventually be nothing more than a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. The audit was nearing its conclusion, and as I walked out of my office and locked the heavy glass door, I knew that the restitution I had promised myself was finally, inevitably, within my reach. The trap was set under the guise of a festive family reunion BBQ, an elaborate theatrical production my father had orchestrated to showcase the newly refinished kitchen that he had arrogantly paid for using the very funds from the predatory bridge loan I now controlled. There were precisely 38 guests scattered across the manicured lawn of the Walnut Street property, a collection of local business owners, country club acquaintances, and nosy neighbors whom Arthur and Elena were desperate to impress with their resurrected status. The air was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of hickory smoke from the high-end Weber Summit charcoal grill and the expensive, floral perfume of women who spent their afternoons at the Pine Valley Club. I chose my entry with the same surgical precision I used to analyze a fraudulent balance sheet, rolling up to the curb at exactly 6:45 p.m. in a 2025 Neptune Blue Porsche Taycan Turbo S, the silent hum of the electric motor acting as a stark contrast to the noisy, desperate laughter coming from the backyard. I stepped out of the vehicle and straightened the lapels of my $2,200 Max Mara Ludmilla Icon coat in tobacco brown, the double-faced cashmere feeling like a suit of armor against the memories of the girl who had once been thrown out of this very driveway into the sleet. I was carrying a slim, matte black leather briefcase from Shinola, its weight signifying the legal documents inside that were about to dismantle the carefully constructed illusions of everyone present. As I walked up the stone path, the rhythmic clicking of my designer heels on the pavement sounded like a countdown clock, and the upbeat classic rock music playing through the outdoor Sonos speakers seemed to falter and die the moment my shadow touched the lawn. A heavy, suffocating silence swept through the crowd as guests turned to stare at the woman who looked like a high-powered executive from a different world, her presence radiating a cold, untouchable authority. My father, Arthur, stood near the grill with a silver spatula in his hand, his face initially freezing in a mask of pure shock before his survival instincts kicked in and he attempted to play it off with his signature brand of false bravado. He wiped his hands on a greasy apron that said King of the Kitchen and stepped forward with a forced, trembling smile that didn't reach his eyes, which were darting nervously toward my car and my coat as if trying to calculate their cost. "Cassidy, look at you! Look at my girl!" he bellowed, his voice booming with a desperate joviality that made my skin crawl as he tried to bridge 12 years of silence with a single, pathetic outburst of feigned affection. He motioned toward the buffet table where platters of artisanal burgers and expensive cheeses sat melting in the humid evening air, telling me to come and have a burger, and suggesting that we find a quiet corner to talk about that little loan business. He spoke of the $450,000 as if it were a minor misunderstanding between friends, a small clerical error that could be smoothed over with a beer and a handshake on the patio. I stood perfectly still, my expression a blank slate of professional detachment, watching as my sister Bianca emerged from the newly renovated kitchen with a tray of crystal wine glasses. She was wearing a silk slip dress and the same arrogant smirk I remembered from the night of the trash bags. But the smirk vanished the moment she saw the logo on the front of my Porsche and the way the neighbors were whispering about my sudden high-status reappearance. My mother, Elena, stood in the background near a cluster of hydrangeas, her hand instinctively going to the Honeywell thermostat through the open kitchen window as if she could adjust the temperature of the confrontation that was about to occur. I didn't move toward the food, and I didn't accept the lukewarm greeting. I simply stood at the edge of the patio, the sun setting behind me and casting a long, dark shadow that stretched all the way to the door of the house they no longer owned. I looked at the refinished kitchen through the sliding glass doors, noting the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the Calicotta marble countertops that had been purchased with the blood-packed money I had forged in the Greyhound station. Every tile and every appliance was a physical manifestation of my father's theft, a monument to his belief that he could use his daughter's life as a revolving credit line to fund his vanity projects. I could smell the fresh paint and the sawdust still lingering in the air, a scent that to me smelled only of insolvency and the impending arrival of the federal marshals. Arthur's attempt to patronize me in front of his guests was a final, pathetic act of a man who didn't realize the auditor was already in the room and the books were already closed. He tried to place a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of faux paternal warmth that I blocked with a sharp, minimal movement of my briefcase, the leather cool and unyielding against his skin. I watched the realization finally start to dawn in his eyes, the flickering understanding that I wasn't here for a family reunion and I wasn't here to negotiate the terms of his surrender. The neighbors were beginning to lean in, their conversations dying out as they realized they were witnessing the opening scene of a tragedy rather than a celebration of middle-class excellence. I felt the dry ice in my heart begin to sublimate into a focused, white-hot energy, the kind of clarity that comes when a decade of planning finally meets the moment of execution. I looked at the guests, the men in their pastel polos and the women with their expensive highlights, and I saw the audience my father had spent his life performing for, the people whose approval was more important to him than his own child's survival. Today, they wouldn't see the successful renovation of a kitchen. They would see the final audit of a fraudulent life conducted by the very person they had been told was a parasite. I adjusted my grip on the briefcase, the metal latch clicking with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the unnatural quiet of the backyard. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and as I looked my father in the eye, I saw the exact moment he realized that the person who owned his debt wasn't a faceless corporation in a blind trust, but the daughter he had thrown out at 11:22 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday night. The music stayed off, the burgers continued to char on the grill, and the Princess of Pennsylvania stood frozen with her tray of crystal, her 2024 Audi Q5 suddenly feeling like a very fragile piece of collateral. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. The math was already doing the work for me, a silent, unstoppable force that was reclaiming the Walnut Street property brick by brick. I thought about the $14 I had in the Greyhound station and the way the sleet felt on my face, and I realized that this BBQ was the most expensive meal my father would ever fail to serve. The trap wasn't just for them. It was the final reconciliation of a ledger that had been out of balance for 12 years, and I was the only one who knew how to sign the bottom line. I opened the briefcase, the white paper of the seizure warrant gleaming under the patio lights like a beacon, and I prepared to show my family exactly what happens when you try to feed an auditor a lie instead of the truth. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak trees that bordered the yard, and for a moment, the smell of the charcoal was replaced by the crisp, ozone scent of an approaching storm. I looked at my mother, who was still frozen by the thermostat, and I wondered if she had ever calculated the cost of her silence, or if she believed that domestic comfort was an acceptable trade for a daughter's soul. She looked back at me with a flicker of recognition that quickly turned to fear as she saw the federal seal on the documents I was pulling out of the Shinola briefcase. My father's hand, the one still holding the spatula, began to shake with a fine, uncontrollable tremor, the silver metal clinking against the side of the grill with a rhythmic, frantic sound. He tried to speak again, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no words came out because there were no words in the English language that could balance the debt he had accrued. The Max Mara coat felt heavy and warm, a luxury that I had earned through every 80-hour work week and every skipped meal in the shadows of Chicago's skyscrapers. I was no longer the girl in the damp sneakers. I was the Senior Forensic Auditor for the IRS, and the house I was standing in was no longer a home, but a seized asset awaiting liquidation. I looked around the lawn one last time, taking in the shocked faces of the neighbors and the desperate, crumbling facade of my parents' lives, and I felt a sense of profound, hollow peace. This was the restitution I had promised myself at 3:15 a.m. on a plastic chair in a bus terminal, not a moment of shared grief, but a moment of absolute, documented accountability. The family reunion was over, the audit was finalized, and the interest on the Blackwood betrayal was finally being collected in full, leaving them with exactly what they had given me 12 years ago. Nothing but the clothes on their backs and the cold air of a Philadelphia night. I stepped forward toward the table, not to take a burger, but to lay the warrant down next to the artisanal cheese plate, the heavy paper weighted with the authority of the United States government and the personal vengeance of a discarded child. The silence was absolute now, a vacuum that swallowed the sound of the distant highway and the chirping of the crickets, leaving only the sound of my father's ragged, uneven breathing. I looked at Bianca, whose iPhone was notably absent now that the drama wasn't going her way, and I saw the fear of the bus station reflected in her eyes for the very first time. I realized then that I hadn't just become the person who decides who keeps their house. I had become the person who defines what a family is, and my definition didn't include anyone standing on this lawn. The audit was complete, the balance sheet was zeroed out, and as the first drop of rain from the approaching storm hit the Calicotta marble countertop inside, I knew that the Blackwood legacy had finally reached its inevitable mathematical end. "The small talk is over, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, humid air of the Philadelphia evening with the cold, clinical precision of a scalpel. I reached into my black leather Shinola briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of documents, each one embossed with the silver, unyielding seal of CB Assets, LLC. I did not look at him as a daughter looks at a father. I looked at him as a senior forensic auditor looks at a delinquent account that has finally reached its expiration date. With a series of measured, deliberate movements, I began handing out copies of the 14-day notice of default to the nearest neighbors, the very people he had spent the last 3 hours trying to impress with his fraudulent hospitality. I watched as their eyes widened, scanning the legal headers and the bold, black ink that detailed the systematic collapse of the Blackwood estate, while my father stood paralyzed, the silver spatula still clutched in a hand that was now visibly shaking. "You haven't made a single legitimate payment in 92 days, Arthur, and the grace period you never deserved has officially dissolved into the black ink on these pages. This entire colonial house, that $12,000 Calicotta marble kitchen island you were just bragging about, and even the high-end Weber Summit grill you are currently using to cook those burgers, they don't belong to the Blackwood family anymore. They belong to me and the firm I control." I opened the final folder and read out the total debt to the very last penny, my voice steady and echoing off the peeling white paint of the house. $512,433.12, inclusive of accrued interest, balloon penalties, and the legal fees associated with your various attempts to hide assets in offshore shell companies. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the fat dripping from the meat into the flames, a rhythmic hissing that sounded like the air escaping from the balloon of his ego. I looked at my sister, Bianca, whose carefully curated life was shattering in real time as she realized the silver 2024 Audi Q5 in the driveway was likely being loaded onto a flatbed truck at this very moment. Bianca began to cry, a jagged, ugly sound that was a far cry from the melodic laughter she had used to record my humiliation 12 years ago, her expensive waterproof mascara beginning to run in dark, pathetic streaks down her cheeks. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a single brightly colored flyer I had printed earlier that morning, a listing for a cramped 400-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated section of Upper Darby that was currently renting for $950 a month. I handed it to her, the paper crisp and mocking in the fading sunlight, and told her that this was much more her speed now that the trust fund of lies had been emptied to the dregs. I made sure to point out that the unit lacked a BMW-sized garage or even a dedicated parking space, suggesting that she should perhaps get acquainted with the SEPTA bus schedule, a ritual I had mastered while she was busy spending our father's stolen equity. The neighbors, once eager for a free meal and a glimpse at a renovated kitchen, were now backing away toward the edge of the lawn, their faces a mixture of voyeuristic fascination and deep-seated embarrassment. My father tried to speak, his mouth working silently as he stared at the CB Assets LLC seal, the realization that his anonymous creditor was the child he had called a parasite, finally sinking into his marrow like the freezing sleet of 2012. I stood my ground, my Max Mara coat draped over my shoulders like a ceremonial robe of justice, and watched as the light left his eyes, replaced by the hollow gray stare of a man who has run out of rooms to hide in. He looked at the house, then at the neighbors, and finally at me, and for the first time in 32 years, I saw him acknowledge a reality that he couldn't manipulate with a loud voice or a false promise. The $450,000 predatory loan had been the final trap, a mathematical cage I had built with his own greed as the bait, and now that the door had snapped shut, there was no key left to find. I leaned in closer, the scent of the hickory smoke mixing with the sharp, metallic smell of the documents in my hand, and I told him that the sheriff would be arriving in exactly 14 days to oversee the physical removal of any remaining belongings that hadn't been seized as collateral. I reminded him that 12 years ago, he had given me 20 minutes and 2 trash bags, but because I am a professional who believes in the letter of the law, I was giving him 2 full weeks to figure out where a disgraced mid-level manager goes when his credit score has been incinerated. My mother, Elna, had finally stepped away from the thermostat and was standing in the shadows of the doorway, her face a pale mask of grief. But I didn't offer her a copy of the flyer or a word of comfort. She had chosen her side on a Tuesday night in Philadelphia when the temperature was 38 degrees, and today, she would have to live with the interest that choice had accrued over a decade of complicity. The total of $512,433.12 was more than just a number. It was the documented price of every slight, every slap, and every hour I spent behind a pharmacy counter while they played at being the royalty of Walnut Street. I watched the guests begin to scurry toward their cars, the BBQ abandoned and the newly refinished kitchen now just a cold, marble-clad evidence locker for a federal investigation. Arthur dropped the spatula into the grass, the silver metal disappearing into the overgrown lawn I used to mow for free, and he looked smaller than I ever thought possible, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a debt that could never be discharged in bankruptcy. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. I felt only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a ledger that had finally been balanced to the 4th decimal point, a sense of order restored to a world that had been chaotic for far too long. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the backyard into a deep purple gloom that made the white Max Mara coat glow like a specter in the dark. I turned away from my father and walked back toward my Porsche Taycan, my heels clicking on the stone path with a rhythm that felt like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. I didn't look back to see if Bianca was still crying or if Arthur was trying to salvage the burgers. I only thought about the $15,600 I had saved and the blood pact I had made with myself at 3:15 a.m. I reached my car and opened the door, the interior smelling of fresh leather and the quiet luxury of a life built on truth rather than credit, and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment to just breathe in the silence. The restitution was complete. Not because I had taken their house, but because I had taken away their ability to lie to themselves and to the world about who they were. They were no longer the Blackwoods of Walnut Street. They were the subjects of a notice of default, a line item in a liquidation report, and a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can build a legacy on the backs of the people they claim to love. I shifted the Porsche into gear and pulled away from the curb. The electric motor hummed a soft, futuristic whisper that drowned out the distant sounds of my father's crumbling world. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and while my family had spent 12 years trying to forget I existed, I had spent every second of that time ensuring that they would never, ever be able to forget the day I came home to collect what was mine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the house getting smaller and smaller, the lights in the windows flickering out one by one as if the building itself were exhaling its final breath. I knew that the next 14 days would be filled with frantic phone calls, desperate pleas for mercy, and perhaps even a few more recordings from Bianca's phone, but none of it mattered anymore. The math was finished, the audit was closed, and the girl who had walked 4.2 miles in the freezing rain had finally reached her destination, standing on the other side of a debt that had been paid in full. I felt the dry ice in my heart finally begin to melt, not into warmth, but into a calm, steady stream of purpose that would carry me forward into a future where I was the only auditor of my own worth. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out. And as I looked at the empty passenger seat of my car, I realized I was perfectly fine with the company I was keeping. The 55-cent stamp on the notice of default was the best investment I had ever made. A tiny piece of adhesive that had finally brought the house of cards down once and for all. I thought about the $300 North Face jacket Bianca was wearing that night and the way she had recorded my exit, and I wondered if she would think to record her own when the movers arrived to take the furniture. I hoped she did, so she could watch it later and understand that the most expensive things in life aren't the cars or the kitchens, but the bridges you burn when you think you're too important to ever need to cross them again. I drove toward the highway, leaving the suburbs of Philadelphia behind for the last time, my eyes fixed on the road ahead and the infinite possibilities of a clean balance sheet. The Blackwood audit was over, and for the first time in my 32 years, I was finally, truly, out of debt. The aftermath of the audit was total and absolute, a mathematical erasure of the Blackwood legacy that left no room for appeal or second chances. They were out of the Walnut Street property in exactly 14 days, a period of time I monitored with clinical detachment through the high-definition security cameras I had installed the very night of the BBQ. I watched the grainy night vision footage from my office in Chicago as Arthur and Elena hauled the remnants of their pride into a U-Haul trailer, their movements slow and defeated under the harsh glow of the street lamps. Arthur is now living in a rusted, single-wide trailer in a park on the outskirts of New Jersey, a place where the air smells of industrial exhaust and the neighbors don't care about his country club stories or his polished golf clubs. Bianca, the former princess of Pennsylvania, finally had to trade her silver Audi and her designer dreams for a blue polyester vest and a name tag, working 40 hours a week at a sprawling big-box retail store for a flat $14 an hour. I heard through the professional grapevine that she was recently reprimanded for taking too many unscheduled breaks to check her phone, a reality check that no amount of social media filtering can hide. I sold the Walnut Street house to a young, hard-working couple for a total profit of $210,000 after settling all the outstanding liens and back taxes my father had neglected. I didn't keep a single cent of that blood money for myself. Instead, I used the entire sum to establish the Blackwood Restitution Scholarship, a foundation dedicated to providing full tuition and housing for students who have been discarded or financially sabotaged by their families. My new life in Chicago is clean, calculated, and remarkably quiet, a sanctuary of order built on the wreckage of a household that valued appearances over the lives of its children. I spend my mornings in my high-rise apartment, drinking my $400 espresso and looking out at the vast gray horizon of the lake, knowing that every asset I own is documented, legitimate, and entirely mine. I have learned through a decade of silence and struggle that the best way to deal with people who treat you like trash is to work until you eventually own the landfill they are forced to live in. The transition from a victim to a benefactor was the final line item in my personal recovery plan, a way to ensure that the $14 I had in the Greyhound station would grow into a forest of opportunity for others. I personally vet the scholarship applicants, reading through hundreds of stories that mirror my own, stories of betrayal, of freezing nights, and of parents who viewed their children as liabilities to be written off. When I sign the checks for their tuition, I use the same black Montblanc fountain pen I used to sign the seizure warrant for my father's house, completing the cycle of redistribution that he started the night he threw my bags to the curb. My mother, Elena, reached out to me once via a letter sent to my office, her handwriting shaky and her tone filled with a soft, desperate regret. But I didn't open the envelope. I simply ran it through the industrial shredder, watching the paper turn into a confetti of silence. There is no interest left to collect on an empty relationship, and the audit of my childhood has been closed, archived, and permanently sealed. Arthur's trailer park existence is the ultimate manifestation of his financial and moral bankruptcy, a small, cramped world that matches the size of the soul he revealed that night in 2012. He spends his days tinkering with a broken lawnmower and watching daytime television, his 2011 Ford F-150 replaced by a bicycle with a rusted chain that he uses to get to the local convenience store. Bianca's Instagram account, which used to be a catalog of unearned luxury, has gone dark, replaced by the crushing anonymity of a minimum wage existence where the only thing that matters is the accuracy of the cash drawer at the end of a shift. I don't feel a sense of joy when I think about their downfall. I feel only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a job well done and a balance sheet that finally makes sense. The world is a much fairer place when the people who exploit others are forced to live within the boundaries of their own limited resources. My high-rise apartment is filled with the things I have earned: the Eames lounge chair, the first edition books on forensic science, and the silence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you are worth. I no longer have to pay a utility fee to feel like I belong, and I no longer have to hide my textbooks or my ambitions from a man who is terrified of being outshone. I have become the architect of my own reality, a woman who understands that the only true security comes from the ability to account for every cent and every emotion in your life. The Blackwood name is now associated with a scholarship rather than a contractor, a transformation that required the total destruction of the original foundation to achieve. I am 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am not waiting for a slap or a roar. I am simply living in the quiet, focused space I carved out of the ice. The story of Cassidy Blackwood is not a story of a daughter who came home to make peace, but a story of an auditor who came home to finish the books. I didn't need their love, and I certainly didn't need their approval. I only needed the restitution that the law and the math provided me. As I sit at my desk and look over the latest quarterly reports for the scholarship fund, I see the names of 22 students who will never have to walk 4.2 miles in the sleet because someone decided they were a parasite. That is the only legacy worth keeping, the only return on investment that actually matters in the grand scheme of a life. I have replaced the two 30-gallon trash bags with a leather briefcase and a federal badge, and I have replaced the heart of dry ice with a mind of pure, unyielding steel. The 14 days they were given to vacate the house were the most peaceful 14 days of my life, a period where the final vestiges of my old identity were packed away and hauled off to the dump along with Arthur's ego. I visited the property one last time after they were gone, walking through the empty rooms where the smell of fresh paint and marble still lingered like a ghost of their failed ambition. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the $12,000 island, and I realized that it didn't look like an island at all. It looked like a tombstone for the people they used to be. I locked the front door, the same door that had clicked shut on me 12 years ago, and I threw the keys into the sewer grate on the corner of Walnut Street before driving away in my Porsche. Arthur is now just a name on a legal document in a Jersey courthouse, and Bianca is just a blue vest in a crowd of workers, and Elena is just a woman who adjusted a thermostat while her life collapsed. They are the footnotes in my success story, the cautionary examples I use when I teach junior auditors about the dangers of arrogance and the inevitability of a thorough investigation. I have learned that family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out. And since no one stayed with Arthur, it is clear that his truth was never worth protecting. My name is Cassidy Blackwood, and my life is now a perfectly balanced ledger, a series of calculated moves that have led me to a place of absolute, unshakable stability. I look at the pocket calculator on my desk, the same one I used in the Greyhound station, and I think about the blood pact I made with myself at 3:15 a.m. I have fulfilled every clause of that agreement, ensuring that the restitution was paid in full and the record was set straight for anyone who cared to look. I don't seek the audience's opinion because the numbers have already spoken, and the numbers are the only language that remains true when everything else falls apart. I am done being a parasite, and I am done being a ghost. I am the owner of the landfill, and the view from the top is much clearer than I ever imagined it could be. The audit is over. The house is sold, the scholarship is thriving, and the girl in the Sleet is finally, permanently warm. Every night before I go to bed, I look out at the city of Chicago and I think about the exact weight of a $512,000 debt and the exact feeling of $14 in a pocket. The distance between those two numbers is the story of my life, a decade-long journey of forensic precision and unrelenting focus. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do is to wait, to watch, and to count until the moment arrives when the debt is called in and the debtor has nothing left to offer. I am Cassidy Blackwood, Senior Forensic Auditor, and I have audited my past and found it wanting, so I have replaced it with a future of my own design. The air in my high-rise is filtered and calm, the lights are dimmed to a perfect glow, and the only sound is the quiet ticking of a life that is finally, irrevocably, in order. The Blackwood Restitution Scholarship is my true monument, a living proof that you can take the shards of a broken childhood and grind them into a lens through which you can see the world with perfect clarity. I have watched the first class of graduates walk across the stage, their faces bright with the same determination I felt in that bus station, and I knew that every cent of the $210,000 profit was worth the decade of isolation. I have turned my father's greed into someone else's opportunity, the ultimate act of forensic accounting and the only form of closure that actually means anything. I am no longer a daughter of Walnut Street. I am the founder of a new legacy, one that doesn't require a country club membership or a silver Audi to prove its worth. The restitution is total, the books are closed, and I am finally, beautifully, alone with the truth.